There's a big probability that you clicked on this video because you want to know how to optimize the water you drink. What you're going to find out with this video is that water is way more mind-blowing, the way it works in our body, than you first thought. It's so mind-blowing that we need to go through a bunch of stuff about how it works in the body and how to actually influence it beyond just drinking water, that we're going to talk about drinking water at the end of the video. And that's not the most important part, that's why it's at the end. If you're trying to impress a romantic interest, you ask, do you like water? And then the person replies, yes, I do like water. Then you can say, well, I'm 70% water, so that means you like 70% of me. Don't actually say that, but we throw around this fact of us being mostly water, our bodies being mostly water in modern society, in comical ways and in scientific ways. But there are very few people who actually make the health connection. Affecting the water in your body negatively will have huge consequences on you because you're 70% water. You're mostly water. And there are many things, as you're going to learn in this video, that affect the water in your body negatively. Generally speaking, you're made of animal cells. And the biggest ingredient in animal cells is cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is the water in our cells. Every cellular process, so from head to toe, whatever is happening, all the energy creation, whatever it might be, is happening in and around or in close proximity to water. The quality of the water inside your cells is one of the things that determine how healthy you are. And that's why water is a pillar of health, and that's why it deserves a video of its own. Remember, there's no life without water. Let's look at circulation. Let's look at the heart. So the proposed model is that the heart is a pump that pumps the blood around. Now let me ask you a question. Relative to the heart, how many blood vessels do we have? We have quite a lot of blood vessels. So the heart is quite far away from your feet, right? It's very far away. And it wouldn't seem like the contraction you can feel in your chest would push the blood all the way to your foot. But the standard model tells us that this is the case. And it's not that the blood vessels are, like the aorta or the veins you see, running on your arm. No, you have capillaries as well, and you have capillaries everywhere. And these capillaries at certain places are as thick, or I should say thin, as a red blood cell. They're one cell thin, which means that you need an intense amount of pressure to push the blood there and then to make it come back. And in fact, Dr. Thomas Cowan says that the red blood cell actually, for a moment, is still, and then it starts moving again. Now, if the heart is what pumps the blood around, even through the capillaries and back, well, that doesn't make sense. Okay, so we need a model for understanding how it is that the blood moves, because it cannot be the heart. That's impossible. That's like expecting water in a garden hose that you've cut in half to go 10 to 20 meters by you blowing on it. That's what we're trying to say here. It's impossible. So what moves the blood around? What's the main force behind circulation if it isn't the heart? To understand this, you have to look at the intrinsic properties of water, specifically the fourth phase of water. So let's look at the phases of water that are known to modern society. You've got solid water, which is ice. You've got liquid water, which we usually refer to as water. And then you've got gas water, which is steam. So you've got solid, liquid, and gas. There is a fourth phase of water, an intermediary phase between the solid phase and the liquid phase, which is called the gelled phase or the structured phase. Let's look at increasingly more important examples of this fourth phase. So let's look at Jello. The Jello that kids eat. Jello is mostly water. I believe it's 97 to 99% water, something like that. And it's water, but it's in a gelled state. So what phase is that? Is that the solid phase? Is that the liquid phase? Or is that the gas phase? It's clearly not the gas phase. It's clearly not the liquid phase, because you poke it and it doesn't run out on the plate or the table. And it's clearly not solid because you poke it and it wobbles. So it's something that's intrinsic to water. Think about it like this. If you look at a cucumber and then you grab a knife and you cut it. The cucumber is, 96 to 98% water. It's mostly water. But when you cut it, water doesn't flow out. Now does it? You're looking at mostly water, aren't you? But water isn't flowing out. So in what state is the water inside of the plant cell in the cucumber? Well, it's in the gelled state, isn't it? It's the same with the jello. And in fact, it's the same with animal cells as well. The jello seems to be in a phase that cannot be matched to any of the phases we know of in modern society. Hence, water scientists like Gerald Pollack say that this is an entirely different phase of water called the fourth phase, the gelled phase, the exclusion zone phase. How does this fourth phase arise? It arises when water comes in contact with a hydrophilic surface or a hydrophilic protein, anything that's hydrophilic, it seems. So what is hydrophilic? Hydrophilic means hydro, water, and philic, loving. So it's a protein or a surface that loves water. Now please look at this picture. To understand what bulk water is in this picture, it's the way we think of water. It's just water molecules floating around without any specific charge, really. So when you pour reverse osmosis water in a glass, that's bulk water. This exclusion zone, however, is the central part of structured water, because you've got this hydrophilic surface, and then because of this hydrophilic surface, an exclusion zone forms. And it's called exclusion zone because it excludes everything that's in the water, really. And it's also negatively charged. It's more viscous, its pH is different, and it's more dense as well. When Jack Kruse talks about charge separation of water and getting free electrons from water to use as energy, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about creating and amplifying this exclusion zone so that we can extract the free electrons from it. And now everything will come together. Because if you take a hydrophilic surface, a water-loving surface, and you roll it up into a tube, so in this picture it's straight, but you can roll it up into a tube so that the inside of the tube is completely filled with a hydrophilic surface. If you put water inside of the tube, the water will suddenly flow from one end to the next. Okay? If you put this tube with a hydrophilic surface inside of it, inside of a lead box, the water doesn't flow. You put it outside in nature or outside the lead box and it flows. If you're familiar with physics, you might understand that it's impossible to create momentum without energy. So there has to be some form of energy in the environment that's making it so that this tube with a hydrophilic surface makes water flow from one end to the next. This energy is the magnetic field of the earth and light from the sun. That's what makes it flow. Now think about the entire circulatory system of a human. You've got hydrophilic surfaces and you've got a water-based solution flowing inside of it, everywhere. And the energy has to be coming from somewhere. And it's coming from the magnetic field of the earth and the sun. So circulation works because the inside of your arteries, your veins, and your capillaries are lined with something called the glycocalyx. They're hydrophilic. All of these things are hydrophilic. The epithelial cells are hydrophilic. They like water. And what they form is this exclusion zone that's called the glycocalyx. And the energy for the water inside that's not of the glycocalyx to move around the body is coming from the magnetic field of the earth and from sunlight. Naturally, it also comes from the heart. It comes from muscle contractions. It comes from movement. It probably also comes from gravity. But these things like the magnetic field of the earth and sunlight are also essential components of circulation. All these things, including the heart as well, are essential components of circulation. And if you remove some of them, you're going to have a big problem. And that's why being outside and being exposed to the magnetic field of the earth and also getting a lot of sunlight is important. That's what gives you good circulation. Now there's more to say about this exclusion zone because it doesn't only line the circulatory system, it also lines your cells. So you got several hydrophilic, water-loving surfaces within the cell. The inner membrane, the inner cellular membrane is hydrophilic, the outer is hydrophobic, and the organelles also have hydrophilic surfaces. So there are exclusion zones there, several exclusion zones. And according to Gerald Pollack, when infrared light hits the exclusion zones inside of our cells, they increase in volume by fourfold. Yeah, so this negatively charged exclusion zone with a bunch of free electrons increases by fourfold when infrared light hits it. And so we're increasing the amount of electrons that we're able to extract from water. What does that mean? That means that we directly get energy from the red light from the sun. That's what it means. And I want you to relate this to photosynthesis. In my interview with Jack Kruse, if you've watched it, I recommend that you do watch it. You can find it over here. I talk about how melanin almost works like photosynthesis because it gives us electrons from water. And melanin does the same thing, but it does it in a little bit of a different manner. Photosynthesis, the way it works, the way we get energy from sunlight, the way plants do that, is they take water and they extract electrons from it. We're doing the same thing. So there are some electrical watches, wristwatches to be more specific, that are solar powered. When sun hits them, their battery is charged. There are other watches that aren't like that. They're not solar powered. The reason I'm telling you this is because this is a perfect analogy as to how we work. We are solar powered. The energy you get from food, you get that directly from sunlight. Now UV does this as well, but UV is even more powerful. So with UV it doesn't penetrate the skin, and so you might think, well, how does it reach all of our cells? Well, let me ask you a question. If you knock on a door, is the sound only heard by you and someone that stands right behind the door, or is it heard in the entire house? It's heard in the entire house. When this UV light energy hits the water, there's a chain reaction. All the water in your body is acted upon. It's the same with curtains. If you close the curtains, the entire room gets dark. Maybe the hallway also gets dark. You open the curtains, everything becomes bright. That's how it works with UV and water. It hits your surfaces and all the water reacts. With water, if I've understood this correctly, by using melanin, we split water and we get electrons and we also get protons. So we get more things than just electrons, but we do get electrons. And this is why infrared light from the sun and UV are so important, because they directly give us energy. And the window in front of me is blocking both of them. So that's why the more you are outside, the better you'll feel. As you may know, when you give an organism less calories and they're able to sustain that state, so let's say 30% less calories and they're able to sustain that state, they live longer. This is reproducible with any animal. The only animal we haven't done this with, according to Michio Kaku, is ourselves. If you're able to directly get energy from sunlight, you're able to eat less, which means sunlight makes you live longer. And if you don't understand this connection, what food eventually gets broken down to is electrons and protons. Sunlight, specifically UV, gives you both. Infrared light gives you electrons. What does that mean? That means that the mechanism of action that gives you energy from food is the same mechanism of action that gives you energy from sunlight. It's the same. And the reason why sunlight is more powerful and energy efficient than food is because you take the food, you have to digest it, you absorb it through the intestines, then it goes to the cell, then it goes through the citric acid cycle, and then you get the protons and the electrons. With sunlight, it hits you and you get it. It's free energy. You're solar powered. You directly use that energy. It's not encumbered by mass. There's no mass to deal with. You just get energy directly. That's it. With food, you have to break it down and everything. This wouldn't be a water video if we didn't mention deuterium. Deuterium is absolutely integral to human health, and you need to understand it if you're going to utilize water correctly. So what is deuterium? Well, first we have to understand hydrogen. Hydrogen is an atom, that's very, very common. I believe it's the most common atom in the universe, and it's got one proton in its core, and it's got one electron. The electron doesn't weigh anything, it's negatively charged. The proton weighs, let's say, 1, and it's positively charged. Now, often in the core you find protons and neutrons, but the standard isotope, so version of hydrogen, only has a proton and an electron. But there is a version, so an isotope of hydrogen, that does have a neutron in its core. And that version is called deuterium. So deuterium has a proton, a neutron in the core, and an electron, which means it weighs twice as much. Now let's think about this for a moment. Where do we create energy? In the mitochondria. How do we create energy in the mitochondria? Through the electron transport chain. But what's happening really? How does that work? Well, you've got something called ATP synthase, and in basic terms, the ATP synthase is rotating really fast and shooting a bunch of hydrogen atoms. And that energy turns ADP into ATP. And so then you get energy. That's how the mitochondria create energy in your cells. Well, so we're reliant on shooting hydrogen atoms at really high speeds, moving them across the cell everywhere. Not across the cell, but in the mitochondria, and also across the cell. Because deuterium will do different things, depending on where it is, of course. We have more deuterium in the blood, and it seems as though we should have more deuterium in the blood. But we don't want it in the mitochondria. Why? Because if you're shooting and essentially moving hydrogen at really high speeds, then you don't want hydrogen to be twice as heavy, because that will make the mitochondria more inefficient. So it's absolutely impossible to have efficient mitochondria or optimize the efficiency of the mitochondria if you have a bunch of deuterium in your mitochondria, in your cells. In my opinion, it's been clearly demonstrated that when you give patients of a certain disease that I cannot mention deuterium depleted water, they live longer. They certainly live longer, and they do far better in terms of this disease that I cannot mention. And you can contact Laszlo Boros, Stephanie Seneff, and Thomas Cowan. Thomas Cowan wrote an entire book about the subject, and a part of it deals with deuterium, and he clearly shows that deuterium depleted water helps with this disease that I cannot mention. Now, this is the part of the video where the true message lies. What is the reverse of photosynthesis? So with photosynthesis, we have water, and we have light, and we have carbon dioxide creating oxygen and energy. And then we use the oxygen and the sugar, the energy, and we turn that into carbon dioxide and water. Now stop. You breathe out carbon dioxide, right? But where does the water go? You're creating water, aren't you? So which water do you think is better? The water you create or the water you drink? In fact, the water you create is the greatest water you could ever drink. I'm mentioning this in conjunction with deuterium because the water you create after having gone through the citric acid cycle, creating energy in the cell, through the reversal of photosynthesis, that water is deuterium depleted. So you create deuterium depleted water, which means that the water you create is far better than the water you can drink. So a very, very important part of health is maximizing the amount of water that your mitochondria create while minimizing any factor that reduces the amount of water your mitochondria create, because that water is really important. And the more hydrated you are, the more hydrated your cells are, the more energy you can get from the environment. The less food you need, the more energy efficient you are in general. So that's why this is so important. You may have heard Dr. Jack Kruse say mitochondrial heteroplasmy, and he uses that as a measurement of aging instead of looking at the degradation of our genes. He doesn't like that paradigm, it seems. He much prefers the mitochondrial paradigm. Now, what does mitochondrial heteroplasmy mean? According to Dr. Jack Kruse, he says that it's the measurement of how much water our mitochondria can create. And so if you can create less water, that means you're probably older or something bad's happening to you. If you don't have mitochondrial heteroplasmy, that's a very good thing. That means your water creating ability in the mitochondria is really well. And again, this is so important. This is so crucial for being a healthy human being that isn't aging, that isn't degenerated, that it's a measurement of aging. It's a really good measurement of aging and how healthy you are. Alright, so you want deuterium depleted water, and we want to create a lot of intracellular water. How do we do that? Well, it's very simple. Look at the rest of my channel, look at the interviews, look at the videos I've made, implement all of that, and you'll be doing exactly that. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, because of the structure of cholesterol and fat, for example, the hydrogens within it cannot be deuterium. Well, for glucose, that can be the case because of its structure. It's okay. It can have hydrogen based on its simpler structure, but with fatty acids, it's impossible. It cannot build the fatty acid out of deuterium. It must be, the normal hydrogen that doesn't have a neutron for the fatty acid to even exist in that form. So, if you eat high-fat foods and you rely on fat as your energy source, you'll be making deuterium depleted water. And in fact, fat gives you more water in general. It creates more water after it goes through the citric acid cycle in total. Which means that from a water point of view, from a deuterium point of view, eating fat over carbohydrates is far better, and at least including a lot of saturated fat in your diet, even if you're going to eat carbohydrates, because this fat gives you deuterium depleted water and a lot of water in general. From a nutrition standpoint, the most important things are to eat a lot of saturated fat and cholesterol. So butter, beef fat, any type of fat-rich food is going to be deuterium depleted because of the nature of how a fatty acid must be built. The plant foods, they're dependent on the deuterium depletion of the environment. And what do I mean by that? So generally speaking, they're not deuterium depleted, but the way plant foods form is through the water that's in the environment. And according to Dr. Jack Kruse, the more close you are to the equator, the higher the deuterium levels in the water. So if you're in Sweden like I am, the deuterium levels are lower than the deuterium levels at the equator, in Ecuador, for example. The deuterium levels are going to be high in Ecuador, while they're going to be low in Sweden. However, Ecuador has more UV, we have far less UV than Ecuador, so it balances itself out. So as Jack Kruse says, if you have access to the cenote system in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, that water is deuterium depleted, and you're also in a high UV environment, which means that you've hacked the game. So generally speaking, if you want to choose a high UV area, you're going to have high deuterium levels in the water you drink. If you choose a low deuterium area, you're not going to have as much UV. If you go to the Yucatan Peninsula and you only drink water from the cenotes, you're going to have both, which makes you a superhuman. Remember how I told you that infrared light and UV charge the cellular batteries? Well, we use that energy that we have in the batteries to create energy in the mitochondria. We use those electrons to create energy. And so if we're doing that and we're creating energy in the mitochondria, that means we're also creating deuterium depleted water as well as water in general. So getting sunlight hydrates you. Yes, you do sweat water out, but you're also getting more hydrated cells at the same time because you're creating water as well. So as long as you drink enough water that's good and deuterium depleted, if you have access to that, it's fine. You're hydrating your cells far more efficiently while being in the sun. Apart from what I've mentioned, if you want to create the most amount of deuterium depleted water and the most amount of water in your cells in general, just watch the rest of my videos, watch the rest of my interviews, watch everything and apply everything, because through my research, what I'm seeing is that whenever you do something healthy, you'll be creating more water in your cells and more deuterium depleted water. The two main things that I haven't mentioned yet in terms of achieving both of these things that we've talked about earlier is pollution and EMF. So with pollution in general kills microorganisms, and you need bacteria to turn deuterium into normal hydrogen. And that's according to Stephanie Seneff. She actually talks about this in the interview I did with her. So watch that interview if you're interested. And with pollution, it messes up the exclusion zone inside of the cell. So you know how infrared light charges up our batteries? Pollution basically kills the battery. It makes it so that it doesn't work. It shortcuts it. With EMF is mitochondrial heteroplasmy deluxe. Okay, so if you want to create less water in your mitochondria and you want to age really fast, expose yourself to EMF, expose yourself to electric fields, magnetic fields, and more specifically RF, radio frequency. Radio frequency, from what I know, is the worst. So Dr. Jack Kruse, Dr. Thomas Cowan, they all say that EMF messes up the mitochondria and the water production in the mitochondria. And I mean, they're very high caliber doctors, and it makes total sense that would disturb the structure of the water and also the function of the mitochondria. So avoid EMF. If you're watching this on a phone or an iPad or a laptop, sit a bit farther away from whatever device you're using and use an Ethernet cable. That's the best thing you can do. And make sure that the Ethernet cable is connected to the grounding system in your house so that the electric field isn't too high. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we finally arrived at hydration. Why did I say in the beginning of the video that hydration will be the last thing we talk about? Because the metabolic water that you create, avoiding EMF, being exposed to sunlight, avoiding pollution, eating a good diet filled with saturated fat and cholesterol, that's way more important for cellular hydration and mitochondrial health, which is hydration, than the water you drink. But the water you drink is also important. So that's why we need to talk about hydration, because your body gives you signals to drink something. Usually this is water. So if your body tells you to drink water, that means that it wants water, which means that that's the correct decision from a health standpoint at that particular moment. So first of all, what happens when we drink water? Well, the main thing is that it gets absorbed in the stomach. The stomach can suck water directly into the bloodstream and also in the intestines. So in the intestines and in the stomach, we suck the water into wherever it needs to go. Water increases our blood volume. So the water doesn't actually go directly to the cells, it increases the blood volume. So you got thick blood, your body tells you to drink water, you drink water, the blood thins out. Okay, so water mainly regulates the blood volume. Drinking water mainly regulates the blood volume. Do you understand why I focused most of the video on metabolic water? This is the reason why. Now this might come as a surprise to you because I am known for following and advocating for the health teachings of Aajonus Vonderplanitz. If you didn't know, Aajonus Vonderplanitz was a health practitioner that recommended a diet that consists of raw animal foods. He also said that water itself isn't very hydrating and that the water inside of raw animal foods and raw milk and raw vegetable juices and fruits is far more hydrating, although he didn't advocate for fruits that much. For many years I've been drinking very, very little water, but now I've been drinking spring water. Why is that? Well, there's a question of whether humans should drink water or not based on the work of Aajonus Vonderplanitz and based on the success stories of the raw primal dieters. So I like to look at indigenous people, or more specifically isolated and primitive people, to understand if a human behavior in terms of health is correct or not, if this is something we should do or if this is something we shouldn't do. So clearly, isolated and primitive tribes, many of them are naked. They get a lot of sunlight. They don't work jobs, they don't have monetary systems, they don't have stress. They hunt, they don't do vigorous exercise, they certainly don't do bicep curls, they're not exposed to pollution or EMF, and their nutrition is always whole foods from the local environment. So we can look at them and understand what it is that we should be doing. Because yes, some tribes have their specific things that they do, like shaving the sides of their head, but that's specific to that tribe. If we look at the things that influence health and we look at many tribes, we can see if a behavior is correct or not. So I looked at the Hadza tribe in Africa, and I also looked at the Warani tribe in the Amazon rainforest of Ecuador. And what I saw is that whenever they're on a hunt and they find water that they can drink, they drink it. With the Hadza, the water was filled with bacteria and it was muddy, which is exactly what we want. We want all of those minerals and the probiotics. They drank that without any issues, and that's probably far better water in the savannah of Tanzania than any Western water you can find that comes from the tap. Because of that structured water, it's completely natural. It's, is influenced by the electromagnetic field of the earth and everything. It's not in a metal pipe. But in any case, they were drinking it. And the people in Ecuador, the indigenous people in Ecuador, were drinking it as well. They were drinking water. They weren't relying on raw animal foods or plant foods. So whenever we have access to water, we do drink it in nature. Do we drink it in the way doctors advocate for in modern society, 8 glasses a day? No. These people don't have such recommendations. They follow their instincts, which is what we should do for optimal health. A moment ago I mentioned structure, I mentioned bacteria, and I mentioned minerals. What are these referring to? These are criteria that your water needs to satisfy for optimal hydration, for optimal health. So let's begin with structure. You may know of Darko Velchik. Darko Velchik talks about the importance of water, the importance of it being mineralized, the importance of it being structured. And he says that you can hold the water to your heart and think nice thoughts, and the water will structure itself. There's a water scientist that I listen to. I don't know if she's a water scientist, but she's definitely a very respected scientist. She did a podcast with Dr. Max Goldhain on his channel, and I listened to it and it was amazing. And she talked about many things that Darko doesn't necessarily mention, scientifically speaking, but the way he talks about water, she basically confirmed that his teachings are scientifically correct. So what am I talking about? Well, I just explained a way of structuring water, of changing the configuration of the H2O molecules, because that's what we're talking about. So water from the tap has a certain configuration of H2O, right? You think these nice thoughts and they rearrange themselves. How does this scientist know this? Why is she saying this? She's obviously a very intelligent individual, so there must be something to it. Well, if you freeze the water and look at it under a microscope, you'll see the structure. And she says that tap water is very ugly. When she vortexes it, or she thinks nice thoughts, she uses some kind of structuring agent, the water, when frozen, changes its structure, and the structure looks far more beautiful. So the structure of the water changes. And if this structure resembles what we see in nature, because the water that's natural in nature, that's moving and is exposed to all the elements, it's naturally structured. It has a certain structure that is adherent or congruent with the water in trees, in animals, etc. The tap water doesn't have this structure. So you do these things like vortexing it or adding things that are structured to it, like saliva. That's just my opinion, and I'm going to talk about this later when we talk about bacteria. Or you think nice thoughts and it structures itself to be more natural, and so when you drink it, it's more congruent with the water in your body, and so hydration will work better. That's the basic explanation. There's no doubt that the water that moves through nature has a different structure compared to the tap water. You understand that. And if you vortex the water with a vortex machine or manually with your hand, it will change its structure. And if you use your finger, then your electromagnetic field, because all living beings have a bioelectromagnetic field, so that will influence the water as well. But this thing about, keeping it at your heart and thinking nice thoughts, what the hell does that do? Because that doesn't sound scientific at all. Well, what I've heard from Dr. Jack Kruse is that we can actually measure the electromagnetic field that's emitted by the heart, and he says that it's several feet, which means that it should be at its strongest right here. So if you put the glass right here, it's certainly being influenced by a bioelectromagnetic field emitted by the heart. So your foot is also emitting the same kind of energy because you're a living being, but the heart should be emitting even more. Practically speaking, water is influenced by your heart. That's just the way it is. And some say that the entire emotional, system in the body, because you can store emotions and trauma. If you think about certain events, you'll start feeling things. And so these emotions are sort of stored in you. These are stored in the water. That's what some water scientists say. Because there have been some experiments that I cannot describe fully, but they're mind-blowing in terms of, sending information via water. So the first criterion was that the water needs to be structured either by nature or by you. We'll get to what to do with reverse osmosis water later, because that's what most people have access to. And so you need to modify that to make it optimal. The second criterion is that the water needs to be mineralized. Now, why is this? Because we need an explanation as to why this is. Outside of any biochemical processes and biology, let's just look at what's available to mammals in nature. What's available is spring water, natural sources of water. And there is not a single natural source of water that I know of that humans tend to drink, and animals in general tend to drink, that doesn't contain naturally occurring minerals. All of them contain naturally occurring minerals. So the best option, thus, is spring water. Spring water is best for many reasons. It satisfies all criteria, really. But for minerals, the best mineral composition is what you'd find in spring water. And it doesn't matter if it's, you live in Pellegrino and you drink some Pellegrino, that's fine. It doesn't matter if it's, some spring water source you have in the forest. As long as it's native to that environment and it's spring water and it's natural, that's fine. That's completely fine. It contains minerals in an appropriate concentration, and that's fine. As long as it's not reverse osmosis water, that's completely fine. So again, it needs to contain minerals. Doesn't matter how many, in my opinion. Doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that it comes from an unpolluted source that's in nature, that's structured, that's exposed to the elements. That's the important part. The third criterion is the presence of microorganisms, and the reason is because bacteria and microorganisms in general are everywhere. You've actually got viruses in your stomach. You've got fungi. You've got bacteria, of course, but you've got all of these other things that you don't associate with the gut microbiome. We don't call it the gut bacteria biome, we call it the microbiome. Microbiome means that it's not just bacteria, it's many microorganisms. Trees have bacteria all over them, the ground, the soil has a bunch of bacteria in it. Everything has bacteria, including the water. So water should be a natural source of probiotics and microorganisms. They work in tandem, we work in tandem with them. We have a symbiotic relationship with them, and the water we drink needs to have bacteria in it. It's a sign of the water being alive, so to speak. Reverse osmosis water and tap water, it's been sterilized. It's not alive. It doesn't have any microorganisms in it. So that's why, again, spring water is the best option, because it does have microorganisms in it. The fourth criterion is that it should be unpolluted. It shouldn't be polluted. That's why you should get spring water. And you should, if your country is good at this, like Sweden is, with Sweden, I mean, they're insane. Every single popular source of spring water that we have over here, we have, the government checking it for chemicals. So I literally checked all the spring water that's in Stockholm. I found many springs. Many of them had chemicals. I went to the one without chemicals. It's quite interesting, honestly, what this country does. And the fifth criterion is that the water should be deuterium depleted. Okay, so we should strive toward having lower deuterium levels. So to give you context, seawater has 155 parts per million of deuterium. So if you don't know what that is, parts per million is, let's say you have a pizza and you cut it into a million slices. Okay? 155 of those million slices are then, in our case, deuterium. The rest are normal hydrogen, the hydrogen in the water molecules. So you want low deuterium levels because obviously your mitochondria don't work well when you have high deuterium levels. So the more you can lower them, the better. You want your deuterium levels, based on my research, to be 130 parts per million. So if you're drinking, water that's got 150 parts per million, that's not very good. Okay, and if you're drinking a lot of that, that's also a problem, because let's say you're eating a high carbohydrate diet and you're not relying on fat, which creates more water than carbohydrates. But again, we went over that. Now we're talking about water. So there are a few options here. What you can do is you can order deuterium depleted water. That's very deuterium depleted. It has, 2 low levels, and you can make it, let's say, 120 parts per million by mixing it with the normal water that you usually drink, with spring water that you have wherever you're at. If you're at higher latitudes, then you don't really need to do this, because the deuterium levels are lower according to Jack Kruse. But if you're at the equator, this might be a good idea. Drinking water that's 120 parts per million, something like that. Wait a minute, we went over 5 criteria, but we only talked about water. What if we can satisfy these 5 criteria with other things that aren't water? So let's look at raw milk. You may know that I drank raw milk for 2 to 3 years, and I drank very, very little water during that period. And I did well. I did fine. Didn't have any major issues. I do feel better now that I'm drinking spring water together with raw milk. Not mixed together, of course, but sometimes my body wants one, sometimes my body wants the other, and I feel like a mix of both is far better. Raw milk satisfies all criteria, doesn't it? It contains bacteria, so it has microorganisms in it. And if you think those microorganisms are bad, then you need to watch my other videos. It has a good structure. It comes from a living being. Of course, it's going to be structured. The water inside of the raw milk, because raw milk is mostly water, is going to be structured. It's mineralized. It's certainly mineralized. It contains a lot of minerals, actually. A lot of magnesium, a lot of the electrolytes in general. So a great source of minerals, and you've got all the necessary minerals for hydration. The only problem with raw milk is if it comes from an unhealthy animal, it's going to have high deuterium levels, and it's also going to be polluted. All the agrochemicals accumulate inside of these animals, and these agrochemicals will be detoxified through the milk of the female cow. So you're going to be drinking agrochemicals, and we don't want that. Again, your hydration source, anything you consume really, anything you put into your body, anything you put on your skin, anything you're exposed to, should be free of pollution. Now that's hard in modern society, but we can do things to mitigate this. And what you have to do in this case is you have to get raw milk from healthy grass-fed animals. And if the animal is grass-fed, again, the deuterium content will be lower, because if you give the cow a bunch of things that kill its gut flora, it will not be able to deplete its deuterium, which means that the milk will have higher deuterium levels, and then you're going to have higher deuterium levels. So bacteria deplete deuterium, you get agrochemicals, they kill the bacteria, you can't deplete the deuterium anymore, and so the deuterium goes higher. Raw milk also has fat in it. It has way more fat than water, and the fat component will always be very low in deuterium. Raw foods in general contain a bunch of water, and they satisfy most of the criteria. However, you have to be careful with high carbohydrate fruits, because they contain a lot of deuterium. For example, coconut water has really high deuterium levels, around 155 to 160 parts per million, and that's really high. You don't want that. You want to be at around 130. So when you consume stuff, as long as you're consuming stuff that is around that level, your level will never go above that, really. So if you want to be on the safe side, don't consume those things. But in fact, that may be bad advice. You know why? Because when we look at these fruits, they usually grow near the equator, and sunlight depletes your deuterium, which means that if you're in an environment with lots of fruits and you eat them, that environment will probably also have a lot of sunshine. So you get that sunshine, you get the sunlight, and you deplete the deuterium. So you have a mechanism for depleting the deuterium, and you have high levels of deuterium in your environment, while you go higher in the latitudes and you don't have a mechanism for depleting the deuterium. However, the water is lower in deuterium and you don't have any fruit. So it kind of goes hand in hand with wherever you are in nature. All in all, food, raw food more specifically, is great for hydration. However, you have to be careful with it. You don't want to consume too many carbohydrates, and You don't want too much deuterium in general, especially if you're in a place that doesn't have a lot of sunlight. If you're in Thailand, you're sunbathing a lot, sure, drink coconut water. If you're in Sweden or in Europe and you're getting coconuts and you're eating coconuts and drinking the coconut water, that's not a good idea. Okay, the coconut oil is fine because it's fat, but the coconut water, you have to avoid that. You can't be drinking that. Then there's how you drink the water. There's the water itself, and then there's also how you drink it. So again, I'm going to remind you again, you drink it whenever your body tells you to drink it. There's a clear craving for meat or fat or water or milk or anything that you're exposed to in your environment that you can eat and you can get energy from it. There's a clear craving toward these things, and water is one of these things. So whenever your body tells you to drink water, you drink it. But how do you drink it? Because I don't want you to chug it. What you do is you sip. You sip it slowly, because then your body can handle the water far more easily. If you have a lot of water in your stomach, your body only needs a certain amount of it. Your body will send the water to your kidneys and you'll pee it out, so you won't be using it. And usually, if you follow all the advice in this video and you modify your diet and you do all of these things, you'll find that whenever you drink water, you will not want more than a few sips. And yeah, that's the only thing your body needs at that moment. If you drink too much, again, that will go to the kidneys. If you sip it slowly, whenever you get the craving for water, the water will be absorbed and it will influence the blood volume, and it won't go to waste. So chugging is bad, sipping is very good, and this goes for raw milk as well. Now let's optimize reverse osmosis water. Reverse osmosis water has a few problems. It's not structured, it doesn't contain any microorganisms, it doesn't contain any minerals whatsoever, it doesn't contain pollution, so it satisfies that criteria. And with deuterium, it depends on where you are in the world. So the deuterium step is going to be, if you are at risk of a certain disease that I cannot mention, it's especially important that you lower your deuterium levels by actually buying deuterium depleted water and mixing it with the reverse osmosis water that you're going to do a bunch of things to that we haven't discussed yet. But if you don't eat a lot of carbohydrates and you get enough sunlight and you eat fairly fat-based, you're not going to have big problems with deuterium. So you're not going to need to drink as much water, and so buying deuterium depleted water is not going to be a huge deal for you. It's not going to give you that much. Is it good? Sure. But to fix the deuterium problem, you'd buy deuterium depleted water online. You pour a third of the deuterium depleted water into this place where you're storing the water, and then 2/3 of the reverse osmosis water that you've done things to, and that would be your water. You don't want to drink it straight up. You want to mix it so that the deuterium levels become normal, because usually the deuterium depleted water is going to be very depleted. Now that's deuterium covered. Let's look at structure. So structuring water, I'd say there are 3 main ways to do it for most people. You either expose the water to sunlight, or you vortex it. You can vortex it with your hand. So you put a finger in the glass and then you spin it around so that you see a vortex, and you keep doing that for, I'd say, 1 to 5 minutes, depending on how much time you have at hand. And the third method would be to put it against your heart and to think nice thoughts. Because if you actually freeze it and you compare it to tap water, you freeze tap water as well, and you look at it under a microscope, you'll see that there is a difference in the structure. And to be more specific, when you're doing these 3 things, you're mimicking the environment that the water would be in nature. So it's been in this dead environment, in the water system of your country, but now you're trying to bring life to it again. You're trying to expose it to the factors that it would be exposed to in nature, and that's why it changes its structure. That's what you're trying to do. The next problem is the mineral problem. It's completely depleted of minerals, so you need to add something to it. There are these artificial mineral supplements that you can add into the water. I don't recommend those because they're not really natural. What I recommend is something that's made in a very natural way and that contains many trace minerals. And I'd say that Celtic sea salt or Celtic sea salt, I don't know how it's pronounced honestly, I'll say Celtic from now on. Celtic sea salt mixed into the water is probably your best bet, because you may understand that the salt, the sodium chloride that they make in the factories, that's just pure toxic sodium chloride. It's a toxic chemical. It's something that's made in a factory. However, when you've got something that comes from the sea, that's a completely different story. It's been exposed to the elements, really. It's been exposed to the earth, and it's very different in terms of its properties. Celtic sea salt doesn't just contain sodium chloride like the factory salt. It contains many other minerals as well. Now here's where I differ from most people who recommend that you put salt inside of water. They put too much salt. I think that you should mimic the mineral concentration that's in spring water, which would mean that if you have 4 liters of water, or a gallon if you're American, you've got this jar with spring water, or not spring water, sorry, reverse osmosis water, it should be like a pinch of salt. That's it. And you let that melt and you let that integrate into the water. And if a person who follows Aajonus Vonderplanitz, because Aajonus Vonderplanitz is of course against all salt consumption, is watching this, what you do is you think about spring water and you think about the fact that there is sodium and chloride dissolved in the spring water. Okay, you reverse engineer that, that's salt. So there's salt dissolved in spring water, and you have no problems with spring water, and Aajonus Vonderplanitz did not have any problems with spring water. All we're trying to do here is we're trying to replicate what's in spring water. That's all. So you add a little bit of salt and you give it some minerals, so it will be more hydrating. Now if you're looking for a specific recommendation, I still won't give it to you, but I'll give you a method for figuring out sort of how to fine-tune it. You can add salt and then you can see, okay, how does it taste? Does it taste nice? And if it tastes nice, drink it. Sure. If it doesn't taste nice, if it tastes too salty for you, reduce the amount. Okay? And if it tastes still lifeless, like reverse osmosis tastes, add a little bit more. That's all you have to do. The last thing we need to fix is the lack of microorganisms in the reverse osmosis water. So what you can do is you can spit in the water. Yes, you can introduce your mouth bacteria, your own bacterial DNA into the water, and that will proliferate inside of the water, and you'll have bacteria in there, which mimics natural water more, and therefore I think it's superior to not doing it. This idea comes from Aajonus Vonderplanitz actually. You don't actually need anything to ferment raw milk. You may know this from my videos, but he said that if you introduce your own bacteria into the milk, it will be more healing for you because the probiotics inside of there will be more suited for your body. Based on his thought process and based on what we see with water in nature, I believe spitting in the water might be a good idea, because then you introduce your own bacteria into there and that will make the water more easily absorbable because it's more alive in general and it contains things that are known to your body. Because your body is there, your bacteria is there, so your body recognizes that. However, you don't need to limit yourself to saliva. If you don't like the idea of spitting in your water, you don't need to do that. What you can do is you can add sauerkraut juice. You can add juice from fermented vegetables, and that will also give you the minerals. So you're getting bacteria and the minerals, and that will, make the water far more hydrating than if you were to not add that in. So sauerkraut juice is great. Lemons don't necessarily contain bacteria, but they're great in terms of minerals and nutrients in general. You can add that in. ACV is good as well, so raw apple cider vinegar. Now I've warned you twice, but I want to mention this once again because it's really important. I get many comments asking me how much meat should I eat, how much fat should I eat, how much of this should I eat, how much of that should I eat, how much. You have to understand that your body determines these things from moment to moment, okay? That information is only accessible to you, and this applies to water as well, and it applies to fat. It applies to fat and water, which are the two things that you need to create water that's inside of you. Or you're not creating it if you're drinking water, but if you're eating fat, then you're creating it. With fat, you have a fat satiety that you follow, and your body will want to use the fat to create water. So a part of your fat satiety is related to your hydration status. That is why consuming fat is hydrating. The same goes for water. You follow your water satiety. If someone tells you to drink 8 glasses of water a day, they don't understand the human body. If someone tells you to drink a gallon of water a day, 3 liters, 2 liters, they don't understand the human body. You should drink the amount of water that your body tells you to consume. That's it. And in general, it's going to be lower than what you might expect and what we see in modern society, because when you switch to this kind of diet and this kind of life where you're optimizing every aspect of health, your mitochondria are going to be very, very efficient, and so they're going to create a lot of water. You're also going to be eating fat. You're relying on fat, which means that you're going to be creating more water than if you were to eat carbohydrates. And because of this, because you're exposed to less pollution, because you're exposed to less EMF, you're going to be creating more water, and so you're going to be drinking less water. That's going to be your experience. So then it pays off to get the absolute best water possible, because you're not going to be going through it as fast. And so whenever your body wants water, you're going to be putting in the best water possible. And remember, the most important part of the video is to understand that optimizing your environment in general, your nutrition, which is a part of your environment, getting sunlight, avoiding EMF, avoiding pollution, these are the things that lead to water and hydration optimization. It's not necessarily the water you drink. If you have trouble applying anything that I say in these videos, I do consultations. If you have any problem that you're dealing with, you have acne, you want to optimize your testosterone, whatever it might be, shoot an email, and I only accept clients that I know I can help, so you have nothing to lose. I have a free PDF, or not a free PDF, it's actually a book that's free called Rules of Nutrition. I believe it's one of the best books you can read in terms of nutrition. It will give you all the core stuff that's really important to understand in terms of nutrition. I also have a book called The 6 Health Commandments. Rather than just focusing on nutrition, it focuses on many other things as well. The pillars of health, what actually makes something healthy. And it's not just the things I mentioned in this video, it's beyond that. With that said, go and achieve excellent health. I know you can do it.